Hi guys! Today we're going to talk about all the books that I read in May. If you watched my June TBR video, you will know that I caught COVID in May and that really threw off my reading plans. I do think I still managed to read quite a bit this month. Luckily, the beginning of my month was pretty strong, but I kind of fizzled out towards the end and my brain turned into scrambled eggs, and even though I was just laying on the couch for hours, I had no bandwidth to be able to process words. So with that, let's get into what I actually did manage to read. So I said I started off the month strong, but I did actually have 2 DNFs like right off the bat. So I was in the mood for like a romance read because I was really excited for Book Lovers coming out, but the beginning of the month I didn't have that book yet. So I picked up an arc that I had called Booked on a Feeling by J.C. Lee. This is a friends to lovers romance. The woman is a sort of high-powered lawyer, and her friend helps his family's brewery, and I think this is actually the second book in a series of romances, but I haven't read the first book. And I think I got about like 30% of the way through this before I DNF'd it. The writing was just really not my jam. I don't want to say it was bad, but it was not great. I don't know, and at this point it feels like I read it so long ago, I'm like trying to remember why exactly I didn't like it, but I do remember getting, about a third of the way through this book, and we had like no background on these people's supposed friendship. We just know that they have been friends, and maybe that's something that like the first book provided more context for, but like I just didn't understand what their connection was or how they met or like how long they had been friends. One character like has held a torch for the other character for like a really long time, but like the other character just suddenly felt very attracted to their friend, and there was just really no great transition from friendly feelings to attraction for them. And I love myself some friends to lovers, but I just don't think this was done very well. I just didn't connect with the characters, and I didn't think the writing was very strong, so I moved on from that one, and then I picked up what I had hoped would be a bit more of a sure thing, because I've read this author before, and that is My Favorite Half-Night Stand by Christina Lauren. I've mentioned this in the past. Christina Lauren's very hit or miss for me. Their like strong stuff is so strong and their weak stuff is just horrible. I don't know why I picked this one up in the first place. I think I've actually talked about this in a recent unhaul, but this book deals very heavily with catfishing. It's also a friends to lovers, and this group of friends all set up like dating profiles, and the one girl in the group of friends doesn't like intentionally set up like a fake profile, but like she kind of makes it more about like who she wishes she could be and like a way to give herself confidence. And she ends up matching with one of her friends, and he doesn't know that it's her, and it just rubbed me the wrong way so hard. And like she had so many opportunities to tell him the truth and didn't. It was just really frustrating, and I did not jive with it. I was not rooting for the main character at all, and if you're not rooting for the main character, then what's the point of reading a romance book? So I got about 60% of the way through this one because I kept hoping it would get better and that like the main character would confess, and she just was not, and it was bad. And she's like actively hooking up with this friend that she also matched with, and she's like hurting her own feelings because he'd go like, they're like a friends with benefits thing, and then he'd go off to message who he thought was another girl, and it's actually her, and it was just like she was getting really upset about it. I'm like, just tell him. I don't know, I'm rambling now, but this was not it. Christina Lauren has much better works out there, and if you don't like catfishing, I would strongly suggest you don't pick that one up. So then I finally got my hands on Book Lover by Emily Henry, and it was everything that I hoped it would be. It's not like an enemies to lovers, it's like a acquaintances to lovers romance. And we follow Nora. She describes herself as like the ex-girlfriend in like all the Hallmark movies who the main character leaves for like a small town girl who owns like a horse farm or something. And she's like very unapologetically like this city girl. She doesn't want a small town life. She ends up actually visiting a small town with her sister and running into someone who works in the publishing industry along with her, who she's met with and kind of gotten off on the wrong foot with in the past. But this is actually the small town that he himself is from, and they end up bonding over their love of the city, and it's really cute. I love their banter a lot, and I love how fiercely, like, independent and sure of herself, like, Nora is. And again, the fact that she is this city girl and she loves her Peloton and doesn't want, like, a small town life is really refreshing in this genre. I think, like, Emily Henry did a really good job of sort of picking apart these tropes that we often see in the romance genre or in, like, Hallmark movies, and really using those to her advantage. And I thought this was really cute. This also has a really strong sisterly relationship between Nora and her sister, who she feels herself drifting away from. And they use this trip to sort of reconnect. And I thought that was really well handled and beautiful. Emily Henry always does a really good job of incorporating this more, like, heavy storyline in with her romances. And it doesn't distract, but it adds to the characters and makes them, like, really well-rounded, and you just love them so much by the end. And that was the case with this one. I really loved it. Probably, I'm trying to think, all of Emily Henry's books so far for me have been 5 stars. I'm not quite sure where this ranks for them. I think Beach Read is still the one that I personally connect with the most, but I think a lot of people will connect with Book Lovers, and I enjoyed it so much. Then I picked up The Mothers by Brit Bennett. This is a book that has been on my TBR for so long. I picked this up as part of my Goodreads Want to Read backlist project. I read The Vanishing Half a couple years ago and really enjoyed it. I thought Brit Bennett's writing was beautiful. And this one, I have very complicated feelings about. I think the first 75 maybe percent of this was so good. I was like, this is a 5-star read. Like, I love her writing. She uses this really interesting element where, like, the mothers in this church is, like, a group of elderly church ladies, and they act as sort of like a Greek chorus. They comment on sort of the plot and what's happening. It's church gossip, but again, delivered in this very classical kind of way. I thought that was so clever and interesting. And the main story focuses on these 3 friends. 2 of them, Nadia and Luke, actually dated secretly in high school, and Nadia ended up pregnant and decided to terminate the pregnancy. And the rest of the plot is sort of what follows from that decision. It was so, I thought, well handled and nuanced. Brit Bennett wasn't, like, condemning anyone's choices. It was just, it felt like a very real life event and how it would impact these people. It just, it was so good. And then Nadia's friend Aubrey ends up getting married to Luke years later, and there was just this thing that happened, like, that I really do not like just in books or movies or narratives in general. It really gave me the ick, and I just had a really hard time with this afterwards, and I was so disappointed because this started off so strong, but it went from, like, a 5-star read to a 3-star read. But I did enjoy going back into Brit Bennett's sort of backlist and reading her debut. I thought it had really strong elements. And even though that particular plot device wasn't for me, I think this is still a really strong book. And I think more people should read it, especially if you enjoyed The Vanishing Half. There's a lot to be enjoyed here. Obviously, there's trigger warnings for abortion and the like. So if that's something that, you know, isn't your jam, maybe avoid it. But otherwise, very good book. Dealt with, I thought, heavy topics quite well, and really gorgeous writing. So again, very complicated feelings about this one, but ultimately I did give it 3 stars. Then I finally picked up Squire, which is a graphic novel. I believe it's a standalone. It's a pretty thick boy, but I thought this was so good. We follow a young girl named Aza, I think it's Aza actually, who's always dreamed of being a knight, but she lives in this empire that has very quickly swallowed up a lot of smaller lands and peoples. Her people are very persecuted in this empire, and she kind of has to hide who she is when she joins up in the military. As the story goes on, she's sort of dealing with her desire to be a knight and have glorious adventures, and the fact that she is working for an empire that actively hates her and her people, which I thought was a lot to handle in a graphic novel, but I thought it was handled really well. Aza is a really fun character. I like how determined and bullheaded she is. She's very runty, like she's small compared to everyone else, but she's able to use that to her advantage. She also befriends a curmudgeonly knight who's sort of retired, and I love a curmudgeonly character, especially when paired with like a rascal, and I thought they made a really fun duo. And yeah, this was a beautiful story. There's a lot of, I think, real life influence involved in the story as well, so I think that was cool. And yeah, I believe I gave this 5 stars. The illustrations are really gorgeous as well, and the end of it has a sort of breakdown of sort of the evolution of these characters, both in their backstory as well as character design, and I always really love that. And I just checked my Goodreads. I did actually give it 4 stars, but it's probably more like a 4.5. This was really good, and if you're looking for a standalone graphic novel to get into, I think this is a great one. I'm going to talk about these next 2 together, and that is Shadow and Hunger of the Gods by John Gwynne. These have been very anticipated reads for me. I picked up Shadow of the Gods last year, like right when it came out, and I only just now got to it, which I'm mad at myself for because they were excellent, but at least I was able to jump right into the second one. So, you know, pros and cons. But yeah, if you haven't somehow heard, these are really big books, I think, in the fantasy sphere right now. They're inspired by Norse mythology, and you definitely feel that. I think if you've played Skyrim and were a fan, you would really enjoy these books. They're multi-POV, and we follow some really awesome characters. So in this first one, we have 3 main points of view. 2 of them are these people who are in like these war bands, and they each have their own sort of motivations. And one of them is kind of seeking glory for herself, and the other one is escaping slavery, and he's also searching to avenge his dead sister. And then our third point of view is this woman named Orca, who I believe John Gwynne referred to her as a retired person of violence. Her story is a bit John Wicky, but I loved that for her, and her storyline kind of feels more set apart because she is so different from these other 2 characters, but all 3 of them were really good, and I enjoyed all 3 perspectives a lot. Like, Orca was my favorite, and I think that's the popular opinion with this book, but all 3 had their merits and were entertaining. Like, I was never bored during this book. I do think there was a bit of a steep learning curve in the first 100 or so pages. My only experience with Norse mythology or like Norse style fantasy settings, like I said, have been either Skyrim, or I recently read a book called The Witch's Heart by Genevieve Gornischek, and that one was a bit more like overtly Norse inspired, or it was more of a retelling actually, whereas like this one has kind of hints if you're familiar, but it's not like you're dealing straight up with like Odin and Loki and Thor and stuff like that. I think there's just some familiar beats, but you don't have to be super well versed in existing Norse mythology. This is definitely its own thing. And I really loved this. Like I said, there was a steep learning curve, but like once I was in it, I was so invested. The ending was amazing. I could not put it down. And I think John Gwynne writes fight scenes so well. Like whether it's 1-on-1, 1-on-12, or like warband versus warband, or even, you know, like against mythical creatures. This is a bit of Skyrim meets Game of Thrones meets The Witcher, I think, in tone, and it was just a lot of fun. So if you enjoy reading fight scenes, definitely pick this up, because John Gwynne, I think, has written the best ones I have ever read. They were so entertaining and engaging, and I was like in it the entire time, feeling very tense and scared for our characters. Absolutely love this one, gave it 5 stars. immediately picked up Hunger of the Gods. And what I do really like right off the bat with this is if you haven't just picked up the first one, he does have a really thorough recap section in the beginning. He has a summary of like where all the characters are now, as well as like a glossary of all the characters and the different warbands you follow. And it was just, I wish every fantasy author did this, because as much as I love fantasy and fantasy series, sometimes if it's been a few months since you've picked up the previous installment, things are a little hazy. So even though I didn't need the recap section, I was really grateful that it was there. And I hope that becomes more of a norm in fantasy, because that was awesome. But yeah, otherwise this one picks up literally right after the events of the first one, so it made for a really clean transition. Other than that recap section, there wasn't a lot of like recap within the narrative. It was just kind of like, okay, just keep going. And I loved that. It really helped with the pacing in the beginning. I do feel like this one was maybe a bit long. Like it's definitely longer than the first one, and I felt it. Even though the action and stuff were still really well written, we had a couple extra point of views that while I enjoyed, it's just, like I said, you felt the extra length of it, and I wasn't really quite sure where some things were going necessarily at first, but I did think it wrapped up in a really cool way, and I did end up ultimately like really enjoying the extra perspectives that John Gwynne included in this one. I was kind of skeptical at first, but I do think they added a lot to the story. So I did give this one a 4-star just because the pacing and stuff wasn't quite as tight as Shadow of the Gods was, but still a super enjoyable series. I loved the setting. I loved the characters. These larger than life gods kind of impacting society is such a fun story, and I cannot wait for the third one. I have no idea when it's coming out, but I will be picking it up immediately. So that's around the time that I ended up getting COVID. So that was my last fantasy book of the month because my brain just couldn't handle it after I got sick. So I ended up picking up the last 2 books in Tessa Dare's Girl Meets Duke series, at least the published ones. I believe there's one more that will be out at some point but isn't yet. So The Governess Game is the second book in this series following the Duchess deal, and we follow a character named Alexandra Mountbatten who goes around and like adjusts clocks and stuff. Sounds like a really boring job, but she is very smart and she's into astronomy, not astrology, astronomy, and she ends up at this house of a man who is not a duke, but he's set to inherit the title. Along with the title comes these 2 wards that he has nothing, like he doesn't know what to do with. So when Alexandra shows up at his doorstep to fix his clocks, he mistakes her for a governess and hires her on the spot, basically. And she's like, I'm not a governess. He's like, I don't care. Someone needs to handle these girls. So she agrees. So she's trying to help these 2 young girls who have been orphaned and shuffled around from house to house and feel like just generally unwanted. She tries to help kind of create more of a home for them while also fighting her feelings for her employer. I believe his name is Chase, actually. And he's a bit of a rake, so she doesn't trust her heart with him, but, you know, it's a romance, so they do end up falling in love. And it was cute. I liked it better than the first one. But overall, I did think the third one, the Wallflower Wager, was the best of the series so far. And in this one, we follow a lady in her own right, Lady Penelope, who is, as the title suggests, a bit of a wallflower. Her debut was kind of a mess, and since then, she's sort of been content to just live with her animals. She takes in a lot of injured and orphaned animals, and not just cats and dogs, but I believe there's a goat, a Highland steer, an otter, just like really random animals. And she lives like in London in a house, and she has this man move in next to her, and he plans to revamp this house that's been sitting empty for quite some time. And the fact that a lady lives next door is going to be a really big selling point for when he decides to flip the house and resell it, because he's a businessman. But her having all these animals is definitely a downside and would hurt his ability to sell the house. So between that and sort of her relatives pressuring her, she has to get rid of all of her animals, and he decides to help her. And in the course of that, obviously they catch feels for one another. And this one was really cute. I thought Tessa Dare handled a couple more like serious subjects quite well in this. Trigger warnings for sexual assault and abuse. But yeah, it was well handled and I thought it was cute. And this was probably my favorite like actual relationship out of the 3 so far. I liked the dynamic where she was part of the sort of upper class and he was a like businessman like in the merchant class, whereas the other ones you have women who are commoners with men who are like gentlemen. So this was my favorite of the 3. I gave The Governess Game 3 stars and I think I gave this one 3.5 or 4 stars. They were cute and they were exactly what my COVID brain needed, just something cute and fluffy, and I had a good time with them. And I don't read a whole lot of historicals, but these were a fun time. Then I picked up a much anticipated read, and that is Emma Straub's This Time Tomorrow. I believe Emma Straub is mostly known for writing like contemporary stories. This one has a bit of like a sci-fi fantasy element in it, and I really enjoyed that. It's kind of like a reverse 13 going on 30. It just hits so hard. So in this one we follow Alice, and she's just turned 40 years old, and her life isn't really like what she thought it would be, and her father is basically on his deathbed, and she kind of thinks back to her 16th birthday quite often and wonders like if the events of that night had gone differently, how different would her life be, which is something that I really enjoy in a story. I think that's a really interesting element. I like the sort of the different possibilities that one life can hold, and she ends up actually finding this weird, I don't want to say portal, that doesn't sound like the right term, but I don't know how else to describe it. And she wakes up on her 16th birthday again with the memory that she was just 40 years old and how her life turns out after this night. And she goes back and tries to kind of change events. And she's able to go back again and again and again and trying to find a life in which her father is healthy and she is happy. I just thought this was so well written. I read this, I was going back and forth between the physical book and I borrowed an ebook from my library so I could read it on my Kindle because I was sick and that was just easier. But I was highlighting so much on my Kindle. I think I have like 15 or 20 highlights on my Goodreads like from this book, and it's not a very long book, but just everything felt so profound, or like just felt like it was something from my own brain. My father passed away a couple years ago, and so that's something I think about a lot, is like if things had gone differently, like could that have changed? And I try not to, linger on that, but it's interesting to read a story that's sort of hits so close. I thought this was really well done. This also has you can tell Emma Straub loves New York and like grew up there and just never wants to leave. And I've never been to New York, but I could feel her love for it. And I thought that was a really cool element as well. So if you like stories about New York, I think this is a strong one. Obviously, it's not just about it, but it feels like its own character in a way. And she sees how the city changes around her as she's kind of going back and forth between these 2 points in her life. And I just thought it was really well done. And I gave this one 5 stars. I don't think it's a 5-star read for everybody. This is my first Emma Straub book, and it's definitely different from what I typically read, but I'm really curious to go back and read some of her other stuff because I really enjoyed this one. And finally this month, I read Something Wilder by Christina Lauren. This is their newest book. I got the ebook from my library because I almost bought it, but for some reason, Christina Lauren's newer books are coming out in hardcover, even though romance doesn't typically. So I was like, I'm gonna hold off on it because I don't even know where they're so hit or miss for me if I wanted to own this book. And I'm still not quite sure how I feel. This is definitely very different from anything else I've read by Christina Lauren. It is a romance, but it's like an adventure romance. It reads a lot like a adventure sort of rom-com feels. It was cute, but I also just like wasn't what I expected. I don't know. So in this one, we follow a woman named Lily Wilder, and she is the daughter of a famous adventurer, treasure hunter named Duke Wilder. She has a very complicated relationship with her father's legacy, as well as, her father in general, but he has since passed at the time of the story. And she ends up running this sort of adventure business where you can sign up to go out into, I think it's is it Utah? And explore like these canyons and the wilderness. And it's the same area where like Butch Cassidy and them would like hide out after they robbed a bank and hide all their treasure and stuff. So she runs these like adventure tours basically where it's like hardcore camping. And on one of these adventure tours, an old flame of hers appears after like 10 years since they had last seen each other, and there's a lot of complicated feelings. Like they never really got closure because of the events that separated them. And so being on this adventure tour sort of rekindles an old flame. And that was quite cute. I enjoyed the romance aspect of it. So while on this adventure tour, it comes to light that Lily's father, Duke, may have actually found Butch Cassidy's basically treasure trove and left clues for where someone else could find it. And they end up on this adventure trying to look for lost treasure. And it was cute, like I said, but it wasn't what I was fully expecting. I saw somebody describe this book as like light and fun. And like, it's definitely fun, but like, there's some heavier moments in this book. And I was like, I don't know if I would call that light, but okay. But yeah, I don't know. I've seen Christina Lauren themselves compare the tone of the story to the Lost City with Sandra Bullock and Channing Tatum, and it does kind of have like a similar feel where there's this adventure and this romance, but there are some higher stakes, and it was fun. I don't know if I would buy this book hardcover, especially brand new. I might pick it up in paperback at some point because it definitely wasn't my least favorite Christina Lauren book, and it was definitely a fun beach read. I read this one on vacation while recovering from being sick, and it was good, again, for the COVID brain, but I don't know if I loved it, so I gave it 3 stars. Okay, and that wraps up everything that I read in May. It was definitely my weirdest reading month so far this year, just with everything that happened, but I did get some really good books in there, so I am pretty happy overall. Let me know down in the comments below if you've read any of these. I would love to talk about them with you. And also feel free to follow my socials down in my description box below, like this video, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And as always, have a lovely day. Bye.